Welcome, wanderer. Tonight, the Firefly crosses a deep valley where two hillsides face each other across a mile of empty air. Here, where a river runs wild and a bridge stands uncertain, two shepherds have learned to speak in light, tracing stars and moons and hearts across the darkness. This is a story about falling in love with a name before a face, about patience and distance and the particular poetry that blooms where we cannot touch, but only signal across the night. Come, let the Firefly show you how loneliness transforms into connection, one lantern flash at a time. The valley was a mile wide at its narrowest point, carved deep by a river that had run wild for millennia before anyone thought to build a bridge across it. Even now, with the bridge finally standing, though everyone called it temporary, though it had been there for 3 years, crossing meant a 2-hour trek down the western slope, across the span, and back up the eastern side. In winter, when ice made the bridge treacherous, or in spring when snowmelt turned the river into a torrent that threatened the supports, crossing was impossible. This was why the shepherds on opposite hillsides had developed their own language. Callum had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his grandfather, a simple system of lantern signals that could communicate the essentials across the dark valley. 1 flash, all well. 2 flashes, wolf sighting. 3 flashes, storm coming. A slow swing left to right, sheep strayed towards the river. A slow swing right to left, help needed. He'd used the signals practically all his life, communicating with old Hendrix on the eastern slope. Then with Hendrix's son after the old man died. Brief functional exchanges that required no words, no crossing, no complication. Then, 2 autumns ago, a different lantern had appeared on the eastern hillside. The first time Callum saw it, he assumed young Hendrix had simply moved his evening position. But the rhythm was different, uncertain, hesitant. When Callum sent the standard greeting, 1 long flash, 1 short, the response came back wrong. 2 short flashes instead of 1 long. He frowned and tried again. This time, the eastern lantern swung in a wide circle, a signal he didn't recognize, though it seemed almost like a question. Over the following weeks, Callum learned that Hendrix had sold his flock and moved to town. The new shepherd was someone else entirely, and whoever they were, they didn't know the traditional signals. So Callum taught them. It started simply. Each evening, when he brought his flock down from the high pasture and settled them for the night, he'd light his lantern and send a greeting. 1 long flash, 1 short. He'd wait, and eventually the eastern lantern would respond. Sometimes correctly, sometimes not. When the response was wrong, he'd repeat his signal patiently until it matched. Within a month, the eastern shepherd had mastered the basic vocabulary. All well, wolf sighting, storm coming, the practical language of hillside survival. Then, one evening in late October, after the usual evening greeting, the eastern lantern began to move in a way Callum hadn't seen before. It traced letters in the air, painstaking, careful, WHO. Who are you? Callum stared across the valley, surprised. In all his years of lantern signals, no one had ever asked for a name. It was always just the Eastern Shepherd or the Western Shepherd, anonymous, functional. But this new shepherd wanted to know. He lifted his lantern and spelled out carefully, Callum. The pause was long. Then the Eastern Lantern responded, Alana. Alana. The Eastern Shepherd was a woman. Callum felt something shift in his chest. A woman, alone on that hillside, managing a flock by herself. It was rare but not unheard of. His own mother had helped his father with the sheep until she died. But Alana was doing it alone, had bought the holding herself, was learning the signals because she had no choice. He found himself thinking about her as he settled his own sheep for the night, wondering if her shelter was warm enough, if her flock was healthy, if she had help during lambing, or if she managed that alone too. The next evening, he added something to his greeting. After the standard signal, he drew a question in the air with his lantern. A small house, then a question mark. Are you well? Is your shelter good? Alana's response came back. A house? A fire? A dog? Yes, she was saying, I'm well. I have warmth and company. Callum drew his own dog, Bracken, a simple four-legged shape with a tail. Then, feeling bold, he drew the sheep grazing. She responded with her own sheep, then added something else. A cat, or possibly a very small dog. Over the following weeks, their conversations expanded beyond the practical signals. Callum would tell her about his day through light, the flock grazing on the high pasture, a bird he'd seen, the shape of clouds. Alana would respond with her own observations. Flowers still blooming despite the cold, the way frost formed patterns onto windows, the stars emerging. They were learning each other through these small exchanges. And slowly, something was changing in Callum. He found himself waiting for the evening signals, wondering what Alana would share. He started noticing beauty, specifically to tell her about it. A particularly vivid sunset, the way mist moved through the valley, the first snow on the peaks. One night, during an early winter storm, Callum sent the standard signal, 3 flashes. Storm coming. Alana responded appropriately, then added something else. A house shape with smoke from the chimney, and then a question mark curve. Are you safe? Are you warm? Something in Callum's chest tightened. She was asking after his welfare, the way he'd been quietly asking after hers. There was care in that question, concern that went beyond neighborly courtesy. He drew his stone shelter, his fire, his dog curled beside it. Yes, he was saying, I'm safe. Thank you for asking. Alana's lantern traced a shape that made his breath catch. A heart. It was simple, unmistakable. A gesture of what? Friendship? Something more? Callum stood in the snow, his lantern growing heavy in his hand, and realized that he'd been thinking about Alana differently for weeks now. Not as a fellow shepherd who happened to be across the valley, but as someone he wanted to know better. Someone whose observations delighted him, whose care touched him, whose presence, even at this distance, had become important. He drew a heart back, his hand shaking slightly, and watched Alana's lantern dance in what could only be joy. After that night, their conversations took on a different quality. There was intention in them now, an acknowledgement of something growing between them. Callum would draw the moon rising, and Alana would respond with stars surrounding it. She would trace the shape of a bird in flight, and he would draw the nest it's returning to. They were courting, Callum realized, across a mile of empty air, using nothing but light and darkness. They were falling in love. It felt absurd. He'd never seen her face, never heard her voice, never stood in the same room with her. All he knew was her name, and that she was a woman who shepherded alone, who noticed beauty, who checked on him during storms. But he also knew how she saw the world. He knew she was patient and playful and thoughtful. He knew that when she drew the valley in light, she saw it the same way he did, not as an obstacle, but as a kind of cathedral, vast and beautiful and worth tending. He knew enough. By the time deep winter arrived, they were writing poetry in light. Callum would draw the sheep settled for the night, and Alana would respond with the moon watching over them both. She would trace the path of wind through the valley, and he would add the snow it carried. They were telling each other stories, sharing their solitude, making it less lonely. One particularly cold January night, Callum drew something he'd been thinking about for weeks. 2 figures on a bridge meeting in the middle. The question was implicit. When the bridge is safe again, will you meet me? Alana's response was immediate. Yes. A heart. The bridge again. Spring. Callum felt his heart race. Spring. When the snowmelt ended and the bridge was safe, they would finally meet face to face. He would learn what she looked like, how her voice sounded, whether the reality matched the connection they'd built in light. The waiting was both agonizing and sweet. Each night they drew to each other across the darkness, building anticipation. Alana would trace a calendar, counting down the weeks. Callum would respond with flowers blooming, spring arriving, time passing. When the snow finally began to melt and the river calmed from its spring torrent, Callum could barely sleep. He'd lived alone on this hillside for 8 years, comfortable with solitude. But now the thought of meeting Alana made him feel 17 again, nervous and hopeful and terrified. The night before they'd agreed to meet, Alana sent a signal that made him laugh. A stick figure with shaking hands and a question mark. "I'm nervous too," she was saying. Callum drew the same figure, then added a heart. "Me too. But I want this anyway." She responded, "Me too." In the morning, Callum bathed in the cold stream, shaved for the first time in weeks, and put on his least patched shirt. He braided a small leather cord as a gift, something to mark the occasion. His hands knew leather and wool better than they knew words. The walk to the bridge took 2 hours. Down the western slope, through the valley bottom where the river ran clear and swift with meltwater, across the wooden planks that still felt too new. And then he stopped. There was a figure on the eastern side of the bridge, standing at the far end, not crossing. Alana. She was tall and lean, dressed in practical shepherd's clothes, much like his own. Wool trousers, a heavy jumper, boots worn soft with use. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a braid, and even from this distance, he could see she was nervous, shifting her weight from foot to foot. They stood like that for a long moment, separated by the bridge's length, neither moving forward. Then Alana did something that made Callum's chest ache with sudden emotion. She held up her hand and, using her fingers, traced a shape in the air between them. a star. The star he'd drawn so many times in light. Callum felt his eyes burn. He lifted his own hand and traced her symbol. A moon. She smiled. Even across the distance he could see it. Bright and real and nervous and hopeful. They walked toward each other slowly, meeting at the bridge's center, exactly as they'd drawn it in light so many times. "Callum," she said, and her voice was lower than he'd expected, warm like honey. "Alana," he replied, and found he was smiling so hard his face hurt. They stood there, awkward and silent for a moment. Then Bracken, who had followed Callum down the slope, trotted past them both and greeted Alana like an old friend, tail wagging. "Traitor," Callum said, but he was laughing. Alana crouched to pet the dog, and Callum saw that her hands were scarred and capable, Sheperd's hands like his own. When she looked up at him, her eyes were the color of the river in shadow, and he felt the same jolt of recognition he'd felt the first time she'd drawn a heart in light. "I was afraid," she admitted, standing. "That meeting would ruin it, that the reality wouldn't match what we'd built." "And does it?" Callum asked quietly. Alana studied his face, the lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind, the rough beard, the weathered skin. "Yes," she said softly, "it does. You look exactly like someone who draws stars into darkness." Callum felt warmth spread through his chest. "And you look like someone who checks on people during storms." They walked together to the eastern side of the bridge, talking in fits and starts, pausing often to let comfortable silence settle between them. It was different from the lantern conversations, messier, more uncertain, but there was a rightness to it too. They were learning a new language together, the language of proximity instead of distance. Alana's holding was smaller than his, her flock about half the size. She'd bought it 3 years ago with money saved from working on other farms, determined to make her own way. She had a small stone cottage, 2 sheepdogs, and a vegetable garden she was constantly battling with slugs over. "I saw your lantern that first night," she said, as they sat outside her cottage, drinking tea in the afternoon sun. "I didn't know the signals. I felt so isolated, so out of my depth. And then you started teaching me, and I realized I wasn't completely alone." "When did you know," Callum asked, "that it was becoming more than practical signals?" Alana was quiet for a moment. "When you asked if I was safe during that first storm. It was such a small thing, but no one had asked me that in I don't know how long. And then, when you drew a heart." She laughed softly. "I remember standing there in the snow, crying and laughing at the same time. This man across the valley, who I'd never met, who only knew my name, was sending me a heart. It felt impossible and perfect." "I didn't mean to fall in love through lantern signals," Callum admitted. "But knowing you were a woman, knowing your name, and then getting to know how you saw the world, it just happened. For me too." Alana reached across the space between them, and her hand found his. "I'd convinced myself I'd chosen this life alone, that shepherding meant solitude, and I'd accepted that. And then you started showing me beauty through light, and I thought, maybe I don't have to choose between this work I love and connection with someone who understands it." "You don't," Callum said. "We don't." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the light change over the valley. "What happens now?" Alana asked finally. Callum had been thinking about this since winter. "I don't know exactly. We can't combine the flocks yet. It's too many sheep for one person to manage alone, and we both need to make a living. And the holdings are too far apart to share daily." "We could take turns," Alana suggested. "Week here, week there. Meet in the middle on market days. Or we could keep our own holdings and meet when we can. The bridge is safe now, most of the year." Alana nodded slowly. "We could still use the lanterns, not because we have to, but because I'd miss it otherwise." "Me too," Callum said. "The ritual of it, the anticipation, the particular language we built together." They made a plan, tentative and flexible. They would court properly now, not just through light, but through presence. They would meet once or twice a week when weather allowed, taking turns crossing the bridge. They would use the lanterns on the nights between, keeping the conversation alive across the distance. And they would see where it led. As the sun set and Callum prepared to make the journey back to his own hillside, Alana walked him to the bridge. "Thank you," she said, "for teaching me the signals." Callum remembered the braided cord in his pocket and pulled it out. "I made this," he said, suddenly shy. "It's not much, but—" Alana took it with careful hands and tied it around her wrist. "It's perfect," she said. They stood at the bridge's center for a moment, neither quite ready to separate. Then Alana did something that made Callum's heart stutter. She reached up and kissed him, soft and brief and certain. "Good night, Callum." "Good night, Alana." He crossed back to the western slope as twilight deepened into dusk. By the time he reached his shelter and lit his lantern, full darkness had fallen. He sent the evening greeting, one long flash, one short. The response came back immediately, perfect, one long, one short. Then Alana drew a heart. Callum drew one back and added a star. She responded with a moon and a bridge. They were still writing poetry in light. But now they knew each other's faces and voices. Now they knew the texture of each other's hands and the sound of each other's laughter. Now the light carried the weight of promises made and futures imagined. Spring passed into summer in a slow dance of meetings and partings. Callum would cross to the eastern hillside on Tuesdays, helping Alana with repairs to her stone walls or shearing her sheep. She would cross to his side on Saturdays, bringing bread she'd baked and helping him move the flock to new pasture. On the nights between, they talked in light. The conversations grew richer now, layered with inside jokes and shared memories. When Callum drew a particular flower, Alana knew it was the one growing outside her cottage. When she traced the shape of a specific cloud, he remembered the day they'd watched it together. As summer turned to autumn and autumn deepened, they began planning for the future. Alana wanted to expand her flock. Callum was thinking about building a larger shelter. They talked about whether they might eventually combine holdings, hire help, build something together. When the first snow fell, a year after Callum had first spelled out his name across the valley, Alana sent an unusual signal. The bridge, covered with snow, and a question mark. The bridge was becoming dangerous again. Soon they wouldn't be able to cross until spring. Callum's response was immediate. A heart, a shelter, a fire, and 2 figures sitting beside it. "Come here," he was saying. "Stay the winter with me." The eastern lantern was still for a long moment. Then it drew something that made Callum laugh and cry at once. 2 sheep, 2 dogs, 2 shepherds, and 1 house, all of it circled by a single enormous heart. "Yes," she was saying. "Yes, I'll come. Yes, let's see what we can build together." She crossed the next day, driving a flock ahead of her, her 2 dogs keeping them in line. Callum met her halfway and helped her bring them up to his high pasture, where there was room enough for both flocks if they were careful. That night, in his stone shelter that suddenly felt like a home, they sat by the fire with all 3 dogs curled at their feet. "We'll need a bigger place," Alana said practically. "This is fine for now, but we could build onto it," Callum suggested. "Come spring, when the ground thaws, add a room, expand the shelter for the sheep." "Or," Alana said slowly, "we could build something new, on the ridge between our 2 hillsides, something that belongs to both of us, not just one." Callum turned this idea over in his mind. A new house built together, positioned so they could see both their holdings. A place that was theirs, not his or hers. "I like that," he said. "We'd combine the flocks," Alana continued. "Hire help during lambing, maybe even take on an apprentice, teach them the way your father taught you." "Teach them the lantern signals," Callum added. "Keep the tradition alive." Alana smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. "We'd still use them ourselves, wouldn't we? Even living in the same house?" "Always," Callum promised. "Some nights, I'll be on one slope with half the flock, and you'll be on the other. We'll send our good nights in light. The independence and the connection, both." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the fire crackle and the wind whisper around the shelter stones. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, soft and steady. "Callum," Alana said after a while, "I'm glad we learned each other's names first, before the hearts and the poetry. It mattered, knowing you were a person with a name, a man living his own life across the valley, not just anonymous signals in the dark." Callum thought about this. The moment he'd spelled out his name, the moment he'd learned hers, that had been the shift. That had been when the other Sheperd became Alana, a real woman with her own story, her own struggles and joys, someone he could imagine, could care about, could fall in love with. "You're right," he said. "The name made you real, made this possible." "And then we fell in love," Alana said softly, "knowing it was you, specifically, Callum who draws stars, not just anyone." "Alana who checks on people during storms," Callum replied, "not just anyone." That night, even though Alana was beside him in the shelter, Callum went outside and lit his lantern. Old habits, strong and good. He drew a heart, then a house, then 2 figures standing together. And from inside the shelter, Alana's laughter rang out. She emerged with her own lantern and drew her response in the falling snow. A star and a moon, circling each other, held in the same sky. They stood together on the western hillside, drawing light into darkness, writing their promises to the valley and the stars. And across the empty eastern slope, their signals reflected in the snow, bright and clear and full of all the things they'd learned to say without words. In spring, they would build their house on the ridge, In summer, they would combine their flocks. In autumn, they would marry in the small village church and teach their first apprentice the language of lantern and light. But that night, they simply stood together under the stars, writing poetry in light the way they always had, the way they always would, patient and playful and perfectly understood. The distance had brought them together. Learning each other's names had made them real to each other. And the light, the beautiful language of light, had taught them how to love. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The lanterns dim on opposite hillsides, their work done for the night, but the light they've written into the darkness remains. Love, we learn, doesn't always need proximity. Sometimes it thrives in the space between, in the patient waiting, in the careful attention we pay across distance. And sometimes the most beautiful language is the one we create together, until two separate lights become one shared constellation. Sleep softly, dear wanderer. May the firefly's light linger in your dreams until we meet again.